I think it's wrong to use Ukraine as a grinding stone against the Russian military, because even though American blood isn't being spilled there, blood is being spilled. We should look for an end to this conflict. But I'm worried that the military-industrial complex doesn't want an end. You know, $54 billion, that's suspiciously close to the annual amount we were spending in Afghanistan every year. And so as soon as we stop spending $50 billion in Afghanistan, now we're spending $50 billion in Ukraine. If only the military-industrial complex made baby formula, you know, we'd be okay. We'd have enough to fill up our swimming pools with that kind of money.
All right, guys, welcome to another episode of the Protestant Libertarian Podcast, and happy Thanksgiving. I don't usually release midweek episodes, but I figured with the holidays coming up, I might as well give you guys a little extra content. And the topic that we're going to talk about today is going to be the war in Ukraine. And it's an issue that we've touched on tangentially in this show before. We've dealt with it here or there in the episodes where we've talked about the military-industrial complex and where we've talked about the overreaches of the war on terror, but we've not devoted an entire episode to Ukraine, and this episode is not going to be very long. This is just going to be kind of a brief introduction to what's happening overseas. And the reason why I'm doing this is that I've had a lot of thoughts about the war in Ukraine for a while now, and I've been reading a lot of different news sources and listening to a lot of podcasts about the war in Ukraine. And I bought a book that came out a couple of months ago by an author named Benjamin Abelow, and the name of the book is How the West Brought War to Ukraine. And I saw that some of the writers for antiwar.com had been promoting this book. And of course, antiwar.com is my go-to for all foreign policy related news. If you've not checked it out, Scott Horton is the executive director or the managing editor or whatever you call the person that's in charge over there. And it's just a fantastic source for all kinds of information about American foreign policies decisions. And that's been my go-to for information about the war in Ukraine. And so this book was recommended by antiwar.com, and I haven't gotten it yet. I bought it on Amazon yesterday with actually a book on Christian nationalism by a scholar from, I think, Yale, Stephen Perry, maybe. I think his last name's Perry. But I follow him on Twitter, and he has a book on Christian nationalism. And so I want to read and learn more about both of these topics. And so I haven't read the book on Ukraine yet because it is on its way to my house. But I wanted to just lay down a couple of markers as to what I think is going on in Ukraine before I read the book and hopefully have a full episode, maybe even get the author of that book on the show for a chat. So the war in Ukraine has been going on for a little while now, and there has been a lot of deliberate misinformation that has been portrayed about the war in Ukraine by the mainstream media and by our politicians. As with everything that happens in the world today, the politicians and the media does nothing but consistently lie to us about what's actually happening. And I think that, as Representative Thomas Massey, who was the voice in the introduction, alluded to, I think that there are financial incentives for the war in Ukraine. And so I wanted to kind of break it down. So I've been reading a couple of articles, and we're going to talk about a couple of articles on the show today. And of course, I'm going to put links to all of them. But there was an article written in October, so a little over a month and a half ago, by Donald A. Smith, who I think has done some writing for antiwar.com. I'm pretty sure this is where I first found this article. But it's an opinion piece. It's called Playing Russian Roulette in Ukraine with Representative Adam Smith, who, based on this article, is a congressional representative from California who has been incredibly supportive of the American effort in Ukraine. And so this article, which is written by Donald Smith, which first appeared, and as I said, in the publication, the South Seattle Emerald, is an overview of some of kind of the highlights of the war in Ukraine. And one of the things that I would recommend you do if you're interested in tracking down this subject is go and take a look at this article, because Donald Smith has a lot of great links to other outside news sources. And so it's a really great source of information. And as I read through this for the first time, I was able to find links to a lot of information that really helped fill in my understanding of the war in Ukraine. So I'm going to talk about that a little bit on the show today. We're going to go through his article, and then we're going to look at a couple of other articles that are related to the show to try to get just a big picture introduction. Like, if you want a very short, one-stop shop libertarian take on what's happening in Ukraine right now, I want this to kind of be that for you. If you've not thought about it, or if you've not given it much consideration, this should at least give you a big picture idea of what's happening over in Ukraine right now. So the article begins with this. He says, Congress, the media, and the public are almost unanimous in their support for what has become a proxy war with Russia as Ukraine tries to repeal Russia's February invasion. Anyone who omits the word unprovoked when referring to that invasion or who questions the wisdom of the proxy war risks being called a Putin apologist. After the lies and debacles of the wars in Vietnam, Afghanistan, and Iraq, you'd expect people to be skeptical of what the neocons running U.S. foreign policy served up in Ukraine. And again, just out of the gates here, he makes a really good point that this is not the first time that our politicians and the complicit media has lied us into a massive war somewhere far overseas that is not in a direct threat to the United States' national security interest. And so he gave the examples of Afghanistan and Iraq, which again, both of those wars had very little to do with hunting down Osama bin Laden and the actual perpetrators of 9/11, and much more to do with nation building and controlling the economy of the world and all kinds of other neoconservative policy goals. And so the point that he makes up front is that we have been lied to as a society before, and yet many people are accepting this next lie, and we're trusting a lot of the same exact people that lied us into wars in Iraq and Afghanistan tell us that we need to be involved in this war in Ukraine now. So even again, the fact that these people were so wrong about the war on terror should be an indication that we need to be skeptical about what they're doing in Ukraine right now. But a lot of people didn't learn their lesson when it came to the last several years of war. Donald Smith goes on here. Yet it's not just far-left anti-war activists and extreme MAGA Republicans such as Tucker Carlson who question U.S. support for the war. Senior diplomats, including George Kennan, former U.S. ambassador to the Soviet Union Jack Matlock, former U.S. ambassador to Russia and CIA Director William Burns, former Secretary of Defense William J. Perry, and even Henry Kissinger have criticized aggressive NATO expansion. For example, Matlock says in Ukraine, Tragedy of a Nation Divided, interference by the United States and its NATO allies in Ukraine's civil struggle has exacerbated the crisis within Ukraine, undermining the possibility of bringing the two easternmost provinces back under Kiev's control and raised the specter of possible conflict between nuclear-armed powers. Furthermore, in denying that Russia has a right to oppose extension of a hostile military alliance to its natural borders, the United States ignores its own history of declaring and enforcing for 2 centuries a sphere of influence in the Western Hemisphere. And I really think that this is one of the most important points that we should be making about the war in Ukraine right now. That the Russians, the way that it's been portrayed in the media is that Ukraine was a completely innocent country with no extreme political ties to the West, and that they were invaded by Russia in the same way that Poland was invaded by Hitler without provocation at the beginning of World War II. And again, the Hitler World War II parallels are always being invoked by those in the media, but that is not the case at all. In fact, the United States has been unnecessarily involved in Eastern European politics for a very long time. There's a really good article that was written, I think, in 2006. It's over at it was published by the Ohio State University, and so I'm going to put a link to it on their website, and I'm looking for the date. Right, yeah, it was written in March of 2016, so a long time before the war that is currently taking place in Ukraine broke out. And the article does give a very balanced presentation of the role of NATO. The article is called NATO's New Order, and it deals with the ways in which NATO has kind of developed and refined and changed their mission or their goals since the end of the Cold War. And it's a very balanced article, which is how you can tell that it was written before the war in Ukraine, because now everything that we hear about Ukraine is nothing but pure war propaganda. But in this OSU article, the author does a very good job of trying to balance both sides of the perspective, both kind of a pro-NATO, both the pro-NATO side that NATO is a legitimate treaty alliance and that they have been doing good work in Europe, and then the kind of the other side that NATO has been a provocation to Russia. They did a great job of balancing that out. And one of the many good points that are made in this article, and I'm going to put a link to it. It'll take you about 10 minutes to read it, but it's just a great background history of NATO and the way in which NATO has constantly changed its goals over time. NATO was formed at the end of World War II to be a direct check on the Warsaw Pact, which was the alliance between the Soviet Union and all of kind of the Soviet satellite states in Eastern Europe and in other parts of the world. And so since that was seen as such a powerful political bloc by the West, the United States and other countries in Western Europe created created NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, to be kind of an economic and political check to the Soviet Union. And really the history of the Cold War is a history of the battle between NATO as an alliance and the Warsaw Pact as an alliance, the Soviet Union. And so NATO's entire purpose, and they do a great job in this OSU article of outlining this, NATO's entire purpose was to act as a check for the Soviet Union. So any rational person would think that in 1991, when the Soviet Union comes to an end on Christmas Day of 91, that NATO should have been at an ending point there, that NATO should have dissolved. Because again, the mission of NATO, which was to be a check to the Soviet Union, was over. Like the war had been won. But this did not happen. And so in the early 1990s, after the fall of the Soviet Union, NATO continued, as this article states for the OSU, NATO continued to try to figure out what exactly its role was going to be after the end of the Cold War. And so there were, according to this argument, or according to this article, many people in Russia that raised objections to NATO and their policies after the end of the Cold War. Because one of the things, again, NATO was designed to check the Warsaw Pact. It should have been over when the Cold War ended, but NATO had continued to expand throughout the 1990s. So in the article, and meaning that NATO kept on bringing in more and more countries that were not included in NATO during the Cold War, and kind of pushing NATO further and further east towards Russia's borders. And so it says in the article here, post-Soviet Russia raised some objections to NATO enlargement into Eastern Europe. Many Russian officials believed that expansion contradicted American promises during the negotiation over German reunification, which took place after the war, despite the language of the final agreements regarding states' rights to choose their own alliances. There were also claims that NATO expansion was directed against Russia, intended to surround the country with adversaries and reduce its ability to act independently in its former sphere of influence. Although Russia's position was weak following the breakup of the Soviet Union and the decline of the economy in the 90s, many Russian officials still saw the country as having a neutral or natural sphere of influence, extending in some cases to Eastern Europe. This, at least some Russians saw former Warsaw Pact countries opting to join NATO as a threat to this sphere of influence. So again, there were many people in Russia in the 1990s that were concerned that the expansion of NATO was a direct threat to Russian interest, and we should not take that. Take that concern lightly. Again, if you look at it not from the perspective of an American who is a part of the global world empire, but from the perspective of a Russian who had just lost one of the greatest wars in human history, at least one of the greatest existential wars in human history, then yes, you would see the extension of an alliance that was designed to fight the Cold War closer and closer to your country's borders as an act of provocation, in the same way that the United States would not have tolerated Canada or Mexico joining the Warsaw Pact and being a part of the Soviet Union. And so there are a lot of reasons going back to the end of the Cold War why people in Russia are skeptical of the expansion of NATO. And of course, the United States is the crown jewel of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. So it makes perfect sense that that would be the case. This article then goes on to explain how more and more countries continued to join NATO during the War on Terror and up into our present period, with many people in the Russian government, especially Vladimir Putin, viewing the expansion of NATO as a direct threat to their power. And so this is going to be one of the biggest points of contention for people that are living in Russia, because again, from their perspective, their attack on Ukraine isn't unprovoked. What it is the United States has tried to expand NATO so far to the east that Ukraine is seen as kind of a last legitimate holdout of Russian influence, and they don't want to lose that influence in the region, which doesn't mean that anything that the Russians are doing is moral or correct. Again, I think the war on Ukraine is an absolute atrocity and an absolute crime. However, I would also say that NATO's expansion is an absolute atrocity and an absolute crime. And from a libertarian perspective, NATO is just kind of an extension of what seems to be a progressing, very large world government. Like, we don't need to have these kind of economic military alliances when all of our countries should just be able to trade freely with each other and live in peace. That should be the goal. But NATO continues to expand and exercise a lot of outsized power and authority in the region. Smith is going to go on to explain this in his article. He's going to quote Thomas Friedman, and he says this: Thomas Friedman wrote a New York Times essay, "This is Putin's war, but America and NATO aren't innocent bystanders." Friedman quotes George Kennan, senior U.S. diplomat during the Cold War. "I think it is the beginning of a new Cold War. I think the Russians will gradually react quite adversely, and it will affect their policies. I think it is a tragic mistake. There was no reason for this whatsoever. No one was threatening anybody else. This expansion would make the founding fathers of this country turn over in their graves, and failing to acknowledge U.S. culpability, risk an extreme backlash from Putin that can include nuclear or chemical attacks." And again, for people that think that Ukraine is an existential crisis, that it's just, kind of a David and Goliath situation where little Ukraine is being bullied around by big Russia, you have to remember that Russia is a nuclear capable country, and so is the United States, which again, as I said before, is the crown jewel of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. So we have to realize that all U.S. action in Russia right now risks a nuclear war. And this has been one point that Scott Horton has been very, very great on over at antiwar.com, on his podcast and in his book, Hotter Than the Sun. And it's something that we need to take into consideration. Smith goes on. In an interview with the Wall Street Journal, a mortal Hague fugitive, Henry Kissinger, says the U.S. is acting in a crazy and irrational way that has brought it to the edge of a war with Russia and China. Mr. Kissinger sees today's world as verging on a disastrous disequilibrium. We are at the edge of war with Russia and China on issues which we partly created without any concept of how this is going to end or what it's supposed to lead to. Evidence that the U.S. provoked Russia and Ukraine can be found in the 2019 RAND Corporation study, Overextending and Unbalancing Russia. It examines nonviolent, cost-imposing options that the United States and its allies could pursue across economic, political, and military areas to stress, overextend, and unbalance Russia's economy and armed forces and the regime's political standing at home and abroad. It includes the paragraph, "Providing lethal aid to Ukraine would exploit Russia's greatest point of external vulnerability, but any increase in U.S. military arms and advice to Ukraine would need to be carefully calibrated to increase the cost to Russia of sustaining its existing commitment without provoking a much wider conflict in which Russia, by reason of proximity, would have significant advantages." So you know that there were already policymakers in Washington that were thinking in 2019, before COVID, before Russia invaded Ukraine, about the possibility of fighting a proxy war with Ukraine. And again, I'm not saying that I agree with absolutely everything that he says in this book, but if you've read Robert Kennedy's book, The Real Anthony Fauci, you know that the government was at least preparing for a COVID-19 type epidemic well before the spring of 2020. And the government's response in large part was based on plans and preparation that they had had in place for several years. It looks like what's going on in Ukraine right now had already been thought out, that they're executing a plan that our politicians and policymakers had created years ago, and that plan is finally being played out in Ukraine right now. So just an interesting note to consider there. He goes on. The New York Times published this past May an opinion piece, "The War in Ukraine May Be Impossible to Stop and the U.S. Deserves Much of the Blame," by Christopher Caldwell. It includes the line, "In 2014, the United States backed an uprising in its final stages of violent uprising against a legitimately elected Ukrainian government of Viktor Yanukovych, which was pro-Russian. The Libertarian Cato Institute published, 'The U.S. and NATO helped trigger the Ukraine war. It's not siding with Putin to admit it.'" And this is an aspect of the Ukraine conflict that has not been very well represented in the media because I think a lot of people don't really understand it. And there have even been a lot of libertarian commentators that have denied what I'm about to say is true. But the Cato article, and again, like if you're very familiar, Cato is a very middle of the road libertarian organization. They're not like Mises Caucus adjacent people like I am. But Cato has this excellent article that, and again, I'll post links to it in the show notes, called "America's Ukraine Hypocrisy Democracy, which was written in 2017. So again, a long time before the war that we are currently seeing in Ukraine took place, about the way in which, there was a revolution in Ukraine in 2014, and the United States' fingerprints were all over that revolution. And so the president that was elected in Ukraine in 2010, his name was Viktor Yanukovych, and I'm probably mispronouncing his name, but Viktor Yanukovych was the president. And in this Cato article, they show that he wasn't a great president. Like he made a lot of very costly decisions, and he rejected. It says that he rejected the European Union's terms for an association agreement with the EU in late 2013 in favor of a Russian offer, and many people within Ukraine were unhappy with that. But Cato's going to point out, and this is really interesting, that despite his leadership defects and character flaws, Yanukovych had been duly elected in balloting that international observers considered reasonably free and fair, about the best standard one can hope for outside the mature Western democracies. A decent respect for democratic institutions and procedures meant that he ought to be able to serve out his lawful term as president, which would have ended in 2016. So the Cato article makes the point that even though Yanukovych was not a great president, he was democratically elected, and people around the world that support democracy or purportedly support democracy ought to embrace that. But they go on. It says neither the domestic opposition nor Washington and its European Union allies behaved in that fashion. Instead, Western leaders made it clear that they supported the efforts of demonstrators to force Yanukovych to reverse course and approve the EU agreement, or if he would not do so, to remove the president before his term expired. Senator John McCain, the ranking Republican on the Senate Armed Services Committee, went to Kiev to show solidarity with the Euromaidan activist. McCain dined with opposition leaders, including members of the ultra-right-wing Svoboda Party, and later appeared on stage in Maidan Square during a mass rally. So again, this is an excellent parallel to what our politicians and our actors and what the people in our media are doing right now. They're going over to Ukraine, and they're taking all these photo ops with President Volodymyr Zelensky over there in the exact same way that we supported those who were trying to oust the sitting president Yanukovych of Ukraine in 2014. They then go on to say that, but McCain's actions were a model of diplomatic restraint compared to the conduct of Victoria Nuland, the Assistant Secretary of State for European and Eurasian Affairs. As Ukraine's political crisis deepened, Nuland and her subordinates became more brazen in favoring the anti-Yanukovych demonstrators. Nuland noted in a speech to the U.S.-Ukraine Foundation on December 13, 2013, that she had traveled to Ukraine 3 times in the weeks following the start of the demonstrations. And again, the extent of the Obama administration's meddling in Ukraine's politics was breathtaking. Russian intelligence intercepted and leaked to the international media a Nuland telephone call in which she and U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine Jeffrey Pyatt discussed in detail their preferences for specific personnel in a post-Yanukovych government. The U.S. favored candidates included Arseniy Yatsenyuk, I don't know how to pronounce that, the man who became prime minister once Yanukovych was ousted from power. And again, we have people that are high up in the Obama administration trying to organize what a post-coup Ukraine was going to look like. And so the article is going to give several examples of how the Obama administration deliberately meddled within this revolution, and that the United States supported the revolutionaries against a democratically elected president of Ukraine, and that the coup that took place in Ukraine in 2014 was an American-backed coup. So not only do we have the first point that he made, the massive expansion of NATO after the end of the Cold War, the massive expansion of an organization that shouldn't exist, I might add, after the Cold War. But then we also have heavy American involvement. And again, this is Nobel Peace Prize winning Democrat Barack Obama and his administration that got us involved in the coup and gave support to those that overthrew the democratically elected president of Ukraine in 2014. If you are a politician or a policymaker sitting in Russia looking at the behavior of the United States and NATO, you might be concerned about what exactly it is they are trying to accomplish in Eastern Europe. Again, I'm not saying that this makes what Vladimir Putin does right. Vladimir Putin is just as much of a war criminal as Barack Obama and Joe Biden and Donald Trump and George W. Bush and Bill Clinton, right? He has just as much blood on his, well, maybe not just as much. He's got plenty of blood on his hands, right? He is just as much of a war criminal as them. But if you put what's happening in Ukraine right now into context, the fact that NATO has pushed its influence further and further east, and that we've been constantly and consistently meddling in Ukrainian politics through the United States, it might be concerning to the Russians what is happening within the country that is right next door. It's a great article. Check it out. There's a lot more details there, but like I said, I'm trying to keep this short, so we're going to keep on rolling here. So going back to Smith's article, he says, in short, it's not pro-Putin to question U.S. support for the war in Ukraine. One should condemn Putin's invasion of Ukraine while also condemning both the glaringly obvious U.S. provocations and American eagerness to escalate the crisis. The U.S. would never allow similar expansions of Russian client states along its borders. Indeed, the CIA tries to overthrow any vaguely socialist country in South America. It's true. The U.S. should push for a negotiated peace in Ukraine instead of another endless, costly, inflation-causing war that risks nuclear holocaust. Due to Ukrainian advances in the war and due to Russia's calling up of additional troops to fight back harder, there are heightened fears among commentators that Russia will need to expand the war or resort to nuclear weapons. Now, the article, Donald Smith here is going to go on to call out a particular representative named Adam Smith, who is a Democrat, I guess, of CD, so Colorado 9. So I think misattributed to him that he was from California. But Adam Smith is from Colorado, and he is the chair of the House Armed Services. But he is representative of the way that a lot of lawmakers in Washington feel about this war. So the article is going to say Representative Adam Smith has been a cheerleader for aggressive arming Ukraine with advanced weaponry, including long-range missiles, as reported on RFE, RL, and Politico. He has repeated the slogan that the war in Ukraine was unprovoked. Moreover, he has been aggressive in funding the U.S. arms buildup near China and in supporting Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan. There is nothing combative about the speaker going to visit Taiwan. Members of Congress go to Taiwan all the time and have for decades, and I'm just worried about letting China decide what's provocative, was a quote from Adam Smith. Sadly, he has been one of the largest benefactors of campaign contributions from military contractors. Oh, so surprise, surprise, the guy in Congress who is pushing us to fund this war in Ukraine is getting campaign kickbacks from military contractors. Of course, that's not suspicious at all. Meanwhile, the 2022 Pentagon budget is slated to be between $800 billion and $1 trillion. How sad that Seattle, which is supposed to be progressive, has a Democratic House member who is totally on board with the costly, destructive, hyper-militarized foreign policy. Seattle. So I guess maybe he's from Washington. I don't know. Maybe there's a typo in the article here. I have to go back and take a look at that. But again, the entire point that I'm making here and that this article is making is that if you take a look at the way that this has been laid out, a lot of the politicians that are pushing for war in Ukraine are receiving benefits from the military contractors that are making an unbelievable amount of money on this war. And we had an episode 15 of the Protestant Libertarian Podcast. If you haven't listened to it and you want another good Thanksgiving Day listen, go check that out. It's with Lori Calhoun of the Libertarian Institute. She had this amazing article called The Military Industrial Cult, and she talks about how the military industrial complex operates like a cult, and that no matter how often they're wrong, no matter how many bad situations the military industrial complex puts us in, they continue to receive funding and support because there are so many different people in the media and in politics that support these companies. And the way that it works is that we have all of these defense companies that contract with the United States government, and they make billions and billions and billions of dollars a year on war. And one of the points that Lori Calhoun made when I had her on the show, and that Thomas Massey makes as well, my congressman from Kentucky's 4th District, one of the points that they make about this war in Ukraine is that the war in Afghanistan ended in the fall of 2021, and the war in Afghanistan was a giant failure from a military and political perspective, but it was also a giant cash cow for all of these defense contracting companies, because whenever we have a long war, people have to make the boots and the guns and the bombs and the knives that are sent overseas and used in these conflicts. So Afghanistan was a giant cash cow that was lost for the military industrial complex in the fall of 2021. And it's no surprise that just a few months later, we would get ourselves involved in a very expensive proxy war, and that that Congress, again, many people in Congress benefit from these defense companies. They get campaign contributions, and this isn't a Republican thing anymore either. It's not like, it never really was a Republican thing to begin with. The idea that the Republicans were full of war hawks is a myth. It's unfortunate that George W. Bush got us involved in these never-ending wars in the Middle East, but it is very apparent that Al Gore would have done the exact same thing had he been elected in 2000. George Bush just happened to be the guy sitting behind the chair. And the reality is, as I've said on this show many times before, is that there is no real difference between the Democrats and the Republicans. I mean, on some of the culture war stuff there is, but when it comes to the deep state, when it comes to the military-industrial complex, when it comes to the ruling class, there is no difference between the Democrats and the Republicans. It's a one-party system for all intents and purposes. And so the Republicans took the blame for the war on terror because George Bush was a Republican and he was the commander-in-chief when the war broke out. But it's not the Republicans' fault. The Democrats would have done the exact same thing. And there's a lot of money to be made in war by these defense contracting companies and a lot of great political kickbacks that come from supporting these wars. So we got to give credit to people like Thomas Massie who are consistently against these wars overseas. So I want to wrap this up real quick. Because again, I think that as we've come to the end of the show, we kind of have a good big picture here. Why did Russia invade Ukraine? It has to do with NATO constantly expanding eastward. It has to do with the United States involvement in Ukrainian politics, and it has to do with the fact that the military-industrial complex is making a lot of money on these wars. I want to make the point one more time too, because I don't think I articulated it clearly a minute ago, that the reason why we're spending all this money on Ukrainian aid, it's not going to help the women and children that don't have homes and foods. All of the money that Congress is passing is going straight to Raytheon and Lockheed Martin and Boeing and all of those companies that profit on war. There's a reason that we are in a massive recession due to government-triggered inflation right now, and the only companies, not the only, but some of the only companies that are producing double-digit stock increases in the United States right now are defense contractors. Again, you can go and look at the stock portfolios of a lot of stock portfolios, or you can go and look at the stock value of a lot of these companies, and you'll see that ever since the war in Ukraine broke out, these companies are doing just fine, and there's absolutely no incentive for them to back down, even though it's inching us closer and closer to a nuclear war with Russia. But I want to end this. It's Thanksgiving. I want to end this on a positive note. So the great Ron Paul wrote an article on November 22nd, which is today, Tuesday, November 22nd, at antiwar.com, and he says, and he gives us a little bit more of an optimistic take on the possibility that this war might come to an end. So he says, last week the world stood on the very edge of a nuclear war as Ukraine's U.S.-funded President Volodymyr Zelensky urged NATO military action over a missile that landed on Polish soil. This is a Russian missile attack on collective security. This is a really significant escalation. Action is needed. But there was a problem. The missile was fired from Ukraine, likely an accident in the fog of war. Was it actually a Russian missile? Was it actually a Russian missile? Of course, that might mean World War III. But Zelensky didn't seem to be bothered by the prospect of the world blown up, judging from his reckless rhetoric. When U.S. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan finally returned Zelensky's call, he is reported to have said, tread carefully on claims Russia was behind the missiles. After 2 days of Washington opposition to his claims, Zelensky finally sort of backed down. And again, this is good. The missile that landed in Poland, there was a missile that landed in Poland last week. Zelensky immediately blamed it on Russia, and there were many people in the West, including within the Biden administration, that wanted to actually investigate what it was before ramping up a full-scale war with Russia. And so this, from Ron Paul's perspective, is an indication that people in Washington are at least open to the possibility that maybe a full-scale war with Russia is a bad idea. So Ron Paul is going to go on. Zelensky must have understood that Washington and Brussels knew it was not a Russian missile. Considering the vast intelligence capabilities of the U.S., it is likely that the U.S. government knew in real time the missiles were not Russian. For Zelensky to claim otherwise seemed almost unhinged, and for what seems like the first time Washington noticed. As a result, there has been a minor but hopefully growing revolt among conservatives in Washington over this dangerous episode. Georgia Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene introduced legislation demanding an audit of the tens of billions of dollars shipped to Ukraine, with perhaps $50 billion more in the pipeline. The resolution currently has 11 co-sponsors. Representative Matt Gaetz has publicly stated that he would not vote for one more dollar for Ukraine. Others, like U.S. Representative Paul Gosar of Arizona, have gone even further. In a recent tweet, Gosar called U.S. support for Ukraine a corrupt money laundering operation, as the fallout from the recent collapse of the FTX crypto exchange points to possible political corruption. His claims may be proven accurate. When Senator Paul introduced an amendment to the massive aid package to Ukraine, calling for someone to audit the funds, he was ridiculed and attacked. 7 months later, his position appears far more accepted, and that's a good thing. When the Ukrainian war hysteria finally dies down, as the COVID hysteria died down before it, it will become obvious to vastly more Americans what an absolute fiasco this whole thing has been. Hopefully, Republicans will accelerate that process when they take the House in January. It cannot come too soon. So Ron Paul offering us a hope that there might be some sanity regarding Ukraine. There's a really good article over on Business Insider about Marjorie Taylor Greene and Thomas Massie's opposition to the war in Ukraine. I really love Thomas Massie, my favorite congressman, incredibly consistent. I voted for him several times. Marjorie Taylor Greene is a Christian nationalist, and so I have a lot of problems with her, some of her political perspectives, but it is heroic that there are people that have stood up to the military-industrial complex on this one, and I think that those people need to be supported. So this episode went just a little bit longer than I anticipated, as they always do, but I do hope that this was a good overview of Ukraine, and it left you feeling like there is at least a possibility that this thing might wind down someday. Again, thank you guys for listening to another episode of the Protestant Libertarian Podcast. I'm really thankful that you guys made it all the way to the very end, and I hope that if you're listening on Thanksgiving Day, that I can make your Thanksgiving Day just a little bit better, that you might have learned something, that you might be more informed, or if you already knew all this stuff and maybe have a lot more knowledge about the situation in Ukraine than me, it was just a nice little reminder that you've been right all along. And no matter what your family members tell you, you can eat Thanksgiving dinner knowing that you have the correct perspective on very important events that are taking place right now around the world. And with that, I'm going to let you guys go. Enjoy your Thanksgiving. Thank you guys for all that you do, and we will see you guys on Tuesday with another excellent episode. Thanks for listening to another episode of the Protestant Libertarian Podcast. If you have any questions or comments or thoughts about the show, please reach out to me at theprotestantlibertarian@gmail.com. You can also follow me on Twitter at ProLibertyPod. Again, you can follow me on Twitter at ProLibertyPod. You can also support the show by leaving a rating or a review on your favorite podcast app. Thank you guys so much for listening, and we'll see you next week.